The signal came from a ship that had stopped answering 14 seconds ago. Not destroyed, not damaged. The UES Dominion's transponder was still active, its hull integrity readings green across every sensor the combined fleet had. It simply was not responding. 4,300 warships hung in formation at the approach corridor to Accord's central space, and the single black vessel at the far end of that corridor had heard Admiral Thak Pauvin's surrender demand and decided, apparently, that it did not require a reply. No running lights, no identification marking, nothing on its hull that said what it was or who had built it or what it wanted, just 2.1 kilometers of black metal sitting in the dark, smaller than the smallest frigate in the fleet arrayed against it, and somehow the most unsettling thing Rel Ashen had observed in 200 years of watching the galaxy make decisions. Regret. Rel was not on the ship. He was in the observation gallery of the resonance spire, on the moon Vithai's IV, watching the sensor feed on a display screen the size of a transport bay door. His transcription stylus was in his hand. He had not written anything in 4 minutes. The combined fleet's formation was, by any measure Rel could apply, the most significant military assembly in Accord history. 50 species, 4,300 vessels, generals and fleet masters whose names the archives would carry for 10,000 years. They had gathered to stop something, and what they had gathered to stop was one ship, and the one ship had not yet moved. Pauvin's demand had been transmitted at 6:12 standard. It was now 6:12 and 40 seconds. Rel found himself counting. The part that comes next is the part the Accord never put in their records. Stay close. At 6:12 and 54 seconds, a voice came through the feed. Not loud, not angry, quiet the way a vacuum is quiet, which is to say it was not the absence of sound but the place where sound goes when it has run out of reasons to exist. You want to know what real leverage looks like, Admiral Rachevel said. She did not wait for an answer. What happened next took 11 seconds. Rel watched the sensor display register a launch signature from the Dominion's forward array. A single object, moving not toward the fleet but away from it, accelerating on a bearing that pointed at nothing, or rather, at a star that sat 60 light-years distant, in an uninhabited system that no species had bothered to name, because there was nothing there worth naming. The sensor bloom began building at the edge of long-range detection range, a white point, growing. Rel had covered the careers of 6 high delegates and transcribed the Accord's response to 14 first contact events and been present for 3 species expulsions in his 200 years of service. He had seen things that would take another species a lifetime to process and had recorded them all in the clean formal language of the archive. He looked down at his transcription surface. He had written, "There are 14 devices." This was number 1. Then below it in the same careful script he had written it again, backwards. He stared at both lines for a moment. Then he looked back at the sensor feed. 4,300 ships. None of them had moved. 731 days earlier, the resonance spire had been a quieter place. Not silent. It was never silent. The translation lattice alone produced a constant low hum, 300 languages running simultaneous through its frequency filter, each one rendered into the listener's preferred sensory register. For Rel, that meant sound. For the Keldrath delegation, it meant vibration felt through the floor. For the Iorath collective's 2 attending members, it meant bioluminescent pulses at the edge of visible spectrum that their compound sensory organs read as language. The chamber accommodated all of them at once, which was either a marvel of engineering or a miracle of patience, depending on which historian you ask. Rel's desk was in the observer gallery, 1 level above the main floor, positioned so that he could see every delegation simultaneously. The living crystal of the spire's walls caught the morning light through Vithai's IV's thin atmosphere and turned it pale gold, slightly green at the edges, the way old glass does. He had sat at this desk for long enough that he had stopped noticing the light most days. That morning he noticed it. He was sharpening his transcription stylus when the main floor below began to fill. Delegations arrived in clusters, the smaller species first, taking the outer ring of floating chairs, then the mid-tier powers filling in around them, and finally the Keldrath block arriving last, which they always did, because they had been here 14,000 years and saw no reason to hurry for anyone. High Delegate Chauvin Tak was 9 feet of charcoal gray exoskeletal plating and 4 upper limbs, 2 of which he used, and 2 of which he kept folded against his midsection in a posture that Rel had learned indicated either contemplation or the specific kind of stillness that preceded a decision already made. His compound amber eyes did not blink. They never did. Rel had spent years early in his career trying to catch Tok blinking, and had eventually concluded it simply wasn't something Tok's biology did, or if it was, Tok had decided not to. The jaw restraint was the thing Rel watched for. It was ceremonial, a strip of tooled composite material that Keldrath formal speakers wore across the lower mandible during sessions when they were not the primary speaker, a signal of deference to the chair. Tok had worn it at every session Rel could remember. The sound of it unclipping, a mechanical snap that the translation lattice carried as a single clean tone across all frequency registers, meant Tok had decided the session was now his to lead. Rel had heard that sound 7 times in 200 years. Each of those 7 times, a species had walked out of the chamber in a condition they had not walked in with. Tok settled into the Keldrath delegation's floating platform, and his jaw restraint was still clasped. Rel let out a breath he had not noticed holding and picked up his stylus. The session opened, a minor trade dispute between the Selûne and a Keldrath-aligned merchant fleet, an amendment to the atmospheric shipping corridors through the Iorath Collective's territory. Standard material. Rel transcribed it in the clean, even strokes he had used for 2 centuries, his stylus moving with the automatic precision of long practice. Then the chamber secretary announced the 3rd item on the agenda. Proposed Measure 7742C, the secretary said. Population Growth Regulation and Expansion Oversight Framework for Category 4 member species, submitted by the Keldrath hegemony. The translation lattice hummed. Category 4. That was the classification the Accord used for species admitted within the last 100 years. There were currently 3. 2 of them were small, slow-growing civilizations that had integrated into Accord trade structures and stayed there. The 3rd was humanity, which had been admitted 52 years ago and had since established 12 colonies, signed bilateral trade agreements with 19 member species, and grown its population at a rate that the Accord's demographic modeling division had reportedly stopped projecting. Because the projections kept returning, results the modeling team found professionally embarrassing. Rel began transcribing the measure's formal title. Then Tok unclipped his jaw restraint. The snap of it crossed the translation lattice and landed in Rel's auditory register like a stone dropped into still water. Rel's stylus stopped. Around the chamber floor, smaller delegations shifted in their chairs. The Selûne representative, bioluminescent and 12-limbed, turned their sensory clusters toward the Keldrath platform with an expression that, on a face Rel understood better, he would have called dread. Fellow members of the Celestial Accord, Tok said. His voice carried both the sonic component that most species heard and the low-frequency vibration that the Keldrath used for emphasis, the kind that arrived in the chest before it resolved into anything the ears could name. We have allowed a situation to develop that requires correction. He let that sit for a moment. The humans. The debate lasted 4 hours. Rel transcribed all of it. Tok's case was, on the surface, administrative. Humanity was growing too fast. Their colonies were disrupting established trade equilibria. Their diplomatic relationships with smaller Accord members were creating leverage imbalances that the hegemony had historically managed without interference. The Accord's founding charter gave the senior member blocks authority to propose corrective frameworks for Category 4 member, and Measure 7742C was precisely that, a framework. The text of the measure itself was 63 pages. Rel had a copy at his desk, which he had begun reading during the 3rd hour of debate when it became clear the vote would happen before the session ended. The word children did not appear in the measure's main body. It appeared in the operational addendum. Subsection 7, paragraph 3, under a heading that read, in the Accord's formal archival language, leverage vectors for compliance acceleration. Rel read that paragraph twice. Then he set the document face down on his desk and did not pick it up again. On the chamber floor, the debate continued. Several mid-tier delegations raised procedural objections. The Selûne bloc requested a delay for impact assessment. A species called the Iorath Collective, who communicated in bioluminescent pulses and occupied star systems no one else wanted, sent a representative to the floor for the first time in 11 years specifically to register a formal concern. The Accord's elder observer seat, occupied by a member of a species whose name translated roughly as the remnant kind, remained empty, as it usually did. Or rather, it had been empty. Rel noticed this in the way he noticed most things, by the fact that something was different from what it had been. The elder observer gallery ran along the upper western curve of the chamber, above the translator lattice housing, and it was traditionally unoccupied. The remnant kind were the oldest sapient observers in the Accord's records, and they did not participate in sessions. They appeared, occasionally, in the physical gallery space. Rel had seen them 3 times in 200 years. There were 2 of them in the gallery now. Their forms shifted, geometric, something between a solid and a decision about being solid. They had not been there when the session opened. Rel did not know when they had arrived, because he had not seen them arrive. He wrote a small note in the margin of his transcription, RK present, Upper Western Gallery, arrival time unknown. Below the main chamber the debate was concluding. The chair called for the vote. The result appeared on the chamber's central display. 847 in favor, 156 against. The crystal walls of the resonance spire absorbed the announcement the way they absorbed every vote, pulling the sound into the mineral structure, recording it in the pattern of molecules rearranged by vibration. The spire's walls held 470 years of decision. Rel had always thought of this as a kind of permanence, a comfort. The record would last. What was decided here would not be forgotten. The walls hummed when this vote was recorded. A low, prolonged resonance, lower than anything the translation lattice process, felt through the floor and the desk, and the bones of Rel's silicon-structured hands, rather than heard through his auditory sensors. He had never felt the walls hum before. He looked at his transcription surface. He had written the vote total correctly. He had written below it, in the same careful archival script, measure 7742C passes. Implementation authority transferred to Keldrath Hegemony Enforcement Command. He had written it backwards. He corrected it. He sat for a moment looking at the correction. Then the session ended, and the chamber began to empty, and Rel packed his stylus into its case and took the long way back to his office, which meant passing through the corridor that ran behind the elder observer gallery. The gallery was empty. The remnant kind were gone. He had not seen them leave, either. The Karis Drift Corridor was 40 light-years from the nearest Accord enforcement station, which was one of the reasons colony fleets used it. Enforcement presence meant inspection, and inspections meant delays, and delays cost money that families who had sold their homes to buy passage on a ship bound for a new world did not have to spare. The drift had been a civilian route for 30 years. No incidents. Not one. It was, in the lexicon of the Terran Survey Corps, a dead quiet lane, which was the highest compliment surveyors gave to empty space. 25 ships, 47,000 people. That number, 47,000, was the kind of number that functioned as a statistic in Accord demographic reports, and as something else entirely when you stood in the corridor of one of those ships and smelled what the recycled air carried, cooking from the family decks 2 levels below, the particular soap that the children's care facilities use, something harder to name that Rel would later struggle to describe in his private notes, and finally write down as anticipation, which he immediately recognized as inadequate but could not improve on. Rel was not on the fleet. He learned about it later, piece by piece, from the official damage reports and the crew deposition, and the recordings that the Accord's own registration system had made. He assembled the picture the way an archivist assembles any picture, from what survived. Commander Nail Droven had been in the Survey Corps for 22 years before the colonization fleet posting started. He was tall and gray-templed, and had the particular quality of attention that Rel recognized in people who had spent years watching things go wrong. He looked at everything twice, as if the first look was just to locate the problem and the second was to understand it. His eyes moved slowly. His orders came quickly. Crew members who served under him described this as reassuring, which was not a word most people used about their commanding officers. He had a habit. Before every navigation order, every course correction, every maneuver, he would reach up with 2 fingers and tap the thing taped above his navigation screen. 2 light touches, then he spoke. The crew had noticed it within the first week, and had stopped noticing it by the 3rd, the way you stop noticing the sound of a ship's engines when they are running correctly. The thing he tapped was a piece of paper, loose leaf, standard weight, the kind sold in school supply packs on a dozen colony world, covered in blue ink, constellations, mapped by a hand that had not yet fully mastered the precise angles required by formal star charts, so they were slightly off. Some of the stars were connected in ways that didn't match any catalog. A few had names written beside them in the same unpracticed hand. His daughter Myra had drawn it the week before launch. She was 9 years old, and she had already decided she wanted to be an astronomer, and she had spent an afternoon making her own version of where they were going. Most of it was wrong, deliberately wrong in some cases, or at least wrong in ways that suggested she had considered the real chart and decided to improve on it. 2 stars near what she had labeled as Cassiopeia had been added that didn't exist in any survey database. She had given them name. Blink Freckle. Rel read about this in the crew's informal ship log, which had survived the attack in one of the emergency data cores. The entry read, Family Day, Day 12 of transit. Captain's daughter Myra drove and sat in the command chair and announced our course using stars she made up. Navigation Officer Oren confirmed course as correct. We have logged Blink and Freckle as navigational references for this voyage. Official Survey Corps designations pending. It was signed by every member of the bridge crew on duty that shift, 6 signatures, including Droven's own. Rel read that entry a number of times that he did not record. Peva Oren was 26, on her first deep space posting navigation officer, because she had graduated at the top of her cohort at the Survey Academy and requested colony fleet duty specifically because, as her application had stated, she wanted to be part of something being built rather than something being maintained. She kept a small clay figure on the corner of her navigation console. It was a rough model of a harbor front from her home city on Earth, a place called Valida on the coast of what used to be Malta. The clay was unpainted, still the color of the earth it had come from. She had made it herself. Rel learned this from her deposition. He wrote it down because the kind of detail that makes a person read is almost always the kind of detail that official records are designed to omit. Dr. Senna Marsh, the fleet's chief medical officer, had been 3 weeks from retirement when the fleet launched. She had stayed because her granddaughter Bee was aboard, traveling with Bee's parents to the colony at Kepler 442. Bee Marsh had delivered Bee herself, 7 years before, in a hospital ward on Earth during a night shift that had run 14 hours. She could not have explained, probably, why that made her want to be on the same ship. She stayed. Cadet Wick Farr was 19 years old and assigned to sensor monitoring, which was a posting that mostly involved watching screens display the same readings for hours at a stretch, and writing in the log that the readings had not changed. He had been at his station for 6 hours on the day the Keldrath battle group appeared on long-range sensors. He ran the contact identification twice before he reported it, not because he doubted the sensors, because he spent 4 minutes hoping the sensors were wrong, and running the identification again was something to do during those 4 minutes that was not simply sitting there knowing what the answer was going to be. It came back the same both times. 15 contacts, military class, Keldrath hegemony encoding, decelerating from transit fold on an intercept bearing. Farr cleared his throat and reported it to Commander Droven. The bridge went quiet the way a room goes quiet when the thing people were trying not to think about walks through the door. Droven was at the command station with 2 cups of coffee. He had drawn them from the bridge dispenser a few minutes before the report came in, one for himself, and one that he had set at the empty station to his left, the station that was technically unmanned on this watch but that he apparently poured a cup for anyway, a habit, or the ghost of one. He looked at Farr's sensor display for a moment without speaking. Then he picked up one of the cups and drank from it and set it back down. Open a channel to all ships, he said. Tell them to hold formation and stay calm, then hail the Keldrath fleet. The main screen resolved into the image of the lead Keldrath vessel's bridge. Admiral Warden Thex Coral had the standard Keldrath build. Charcoal gray plating, 4 upper limbs, amber compound eyes. His voice arrived as both sound and vibration, the low-frequency component hitting the chest before the ears registered the words, so that the crew heard the meaning a fraction of a second after they had already felt the weight of it. Human fleet, Coral said, you will cease all engine activity and prepare for boarding. Droven leaned forward slightly. "This is Commander Nail Droven, UES Horizon. We are a civilian colony fleet in transit to Kepler 442b under valid Accord registration. State the nature of your intercept." Coral's amber eyes did not shift. "The Celestial Accord has passed Measure 7742C. You are in violation of its term. You will return to Earth. You will abandon your current colonization effort. You will accept the population ceilings as specified." "These people have sold their homes," Droven said. "They have children aboard." "Yes," Coral said, "we know." The channel closed. For approximately 2 seconds, no one on the bridge moved. Then Peva Oren's hand moved toward the Clay Harbor figure on her console, not picking it up, just touching it, the tips of her fingers against the rough, unpainted surface. The way a person touches something real when everything else has stopped feeling that way. Droven reached up and tapped the star chart. 2 fingers, once. "Red alert," he said. "Get the families to emergency positions." What happened next took 4 minutes. Rel would spend the following months reading the technical analysis. The Keldrath targeting solution had been calculated before the intercept, before the demand, before Droven's refusal. The family deck coordinates for every ship in the colony fleet had been pulled from the Accord's own registration database, the same database where the fleet had filed its passenger manifest 7 weeks before departure, the same database that Rel had helped design the intake procedure 20 years before, when the Accord had decided that standardized registration would improve safety for civilian vessels. The weapons did not strike randomly. They did not strike at engines or command centers or the structural points a military target analysis would prioritize. They struck the family decks, the schools, the recreation area, the medical facilities where children went for checkups. They struck places cross-referenced against the manifests that listed names and ages and assigned quarters, and they struck them in an order that suggested the targeting sequence had been optimized not for maximum structural damage, but for maximum location of the specific demographic the planners had been looking for. The Keldrath targeting system had cross-referenced family quarters specifically. The strike pattern was not a byproduct of war. It was the blueprint of it. Rel did not learn this immediately. He learned it in stages, each one worse than the last, over the course of the weeks that followed. But the number, when it finally settled into the record, was this: 589 children. The youngest was 2 years old. The oldest was 14. He did not write about any of them by name in his official transcription. Official transcriptions did not work that way. But in his private notes, which he kept in a secondary record that was his own and no one else's, he wrote about one of them. Myra Droven was 9 years old. She was on the observation deck when the attack began, which was on the aft section of the UES Horizon's family level, a long room with a curved, transparent wall that looked out onto the stars. She went there often during the transit, according to crew records, sometimes with her father and sometimes alone. She was looking for Blink and Freckle. The hull breach reached her section 40 seconds into the attack. The emergency force field engaged and failed within 6 seconds, which was 4 seconds longer than specification and not long enough to matter. The section depressurized. Droven was on the bridge when it happened. The external camera feed covered the observation deck. He watched it. What followed was 11 minutes of silence from the commanding officer of UES Horizon, during which time Lieutenant Peva Oren managed the fleet's emergency response. Coordinated evacuation pods, 3 ships that had taken catastrophic hull damage, and kept the formation from fragmenting through a combination of direct orders and the particular quality of voice that people sometimes discover they have when there is no alternative to having it. Then Droven spoke. His voice was the same as it always was, the same pace, the same precision. The crew said later that this was the thing they remembered most. Not that it was calm, that it was identical to his voice before, as if something had closed in him that was never going to open again, and on the other side of the closing was a person who sounded exactly like the person before but was operating on different instructions. "So your orders?" Oren asked. Droven looked at the star chart above the navigation screen, at the paper going yellow at the edges, at the blue ink, the wrong constellations, the 2 invented stars near Cassiopeia. "Get the survivors home," he said. "Then we go back to work." The Keldrath fleet did not pursue them. They had done what they came to do. The final count, assembled from damage reports and crew manifests and the emergency data cores that survived, was 589 children dead, 312 adults, 11 ships with catastrophic damage. The youngest child who died was 2 years old. The oldest was 14. The youngest child who survived was 3 days old, delivered by Dr. Senna Marsh in the medical bay of the hospital ship 40 minutes after the attack ended, while Marsh was simultaneously treating 17 critical injury and had not yet been told that her granddaughter B was not among the survivors. Rel received the official Accord damage report 14 days after the attack. It had been filed by the Keldrath Hegemony's Enforcement Committee, who were required by Accord Charter to submit incident documentation within 15 days of any enforcement action. The report listed the action as a successful compliance intervention. It listed the civilian casualty under a subheading titled Collateral Leverage. He sat with that phrase for a long time. Then he picked up his stylus and began transcribing the report into the official record, as his position required him to do. He transcribed it backwards. He caught himself after 6 lines. He corrected it. He filed it. He closed his transcription surface and sat in his office in the resonant spire with the pale gold light coming through the living crystal of the walls, and he did not write anything else that day. At Karis Drift, the surviving ships turned for home. Behind them, the debris field from the attack drifted in the slow gravity of empty space. Fragments of hull plating, personal effects, a clay harbor figure, unpainted, still the color of earth, turning end over end in the dark. A piece of paper, blue ink, 3 strips of hull repair tape still attached, spinning slowly away from the wreck of what had been the observation deck. The ink had not faded. 3 months passed. Rel noticed the absence before he noticed the cause. Keldrath reporting had a rhythm: weekly enforcement summary, monthly trade assessments, the quarterly diplomatic correspondence that the hegemony filed with the Accord's Administrative Bureau, with the consistency of something that had been done the same way for 14,000 years. The rhythm stopped, not all at once. Station Velthara, a small Keldrath outpost on the edge of what the hegemony called its administrative zone, filed its weekly summary on a Tuesday and then did not file on the following Tuesday. The Bureau sent an automated inquiry. No response. 17 days after the last summary, a Zephyrian cargo freighter docked at Velthara for resupply and found the station intact, operational, fully powered, and empty. No distress signal, no damage. The food preparation units in the station's common area were still warm. The computer systems were running. Every Keldrath who had been assigned to the station was gone. The freighter captain filed a report with the Accord's Trade Monitoring Bureau, noting the situation as anomalous. The Bureau logged it. The logging came to Rel's desk as part of his weekly archive intake. He read it 3 times. Then the same thing happened at Station Palrak. Then at 3 stations simultaneously, over a 4-day period. Then at a Keldrath patrol waypoint that had been continuously staffed for 2 centuries. The Keldrath military dispatched investigation team. Rel received the investigation reports as they arrived, because everything arrived at his desk eventually. The teams found nothing. Not the nothing of a crime scene that had been cleaned, the nothing of a place that had simply been vacated quickly, without violence, as if everyone had decided to leave at the same moment and had left through a door that the investigators couldn't find. What the investigation teams also reported, in the technical language of sensor analysis, was that their long-range arrays had detected anomalous readings in the days before each station's disappearance. The readings described objects that were intermittently present, appearing at the edge of sensor resolution, and then not appearing, not in the way that objects leave sensor range, but in the way that a probability resolves and then unresolved, as if the objects were real in some moments and not real in others. The Hegemony's Science Bureau filed a formal complaint with the Accord, requesting that the Accord identify and sanction whatever member species was using technology that violated standard sensor protocols. The complaint was addressed to Ambassador Theva Oren, who represented humanity at the Accord. Oren was a small woman who wore the plain blue uniform of the Terran Diplomatic Service and had the quality of stillness that Rel associated people who had decided, at some point prior to any specific occasion, what they were going to do if it came to them. She had been present at the vote. She had watched the result appear on the chamber display. She had not moved, had not spoken, had not changed expression in any way that the translation lattice registered. Rel had been watching her when the vote came in. He had written in his private notes, Ambassador Oren received the result, did not react. This is not the same as having no reaction. She attended the meeting of the Accord's Enforcement Committee, which convened to address the Keldrath complaint. She sat in the human delegation's chair. She had been in that chair through 4 hours of debate without speaking when the committee chair, a Zephyrian administrator named Halath Saren, addressed her directly. Ambassador, Saren said, your government has not responded to the Keldrath complaint. We would ask formally whether humanity has knowledge of the incidents at the affected station. Oren looked at him. The translation lattice carried this, as it carried everything. The angle of her head, the direction of her gaze, the stillness of her hands on the table's surface. It rendered these things in each species' preferred register. In Rel's register, which processed social information through micro-vibration patterns in the translation lattice's ambient hum, it came through as, I am looking at you, and I have nothing to say to you, and I want you to understand that the nothing is not an absence. She did not speak. Saren asked again, more formally, citing the procedural requirement that member species respond to direct address within the session. Oren looked at the table. Saren moved on. Rel wrote in his private notes, Day 94 post-Karis drift. Ambassador Oren has not spoken in the chamber. This is now the dominant fact of every session she attends. And then, at roughly the 12,000 character mark of the arc Rel was slowly, without intending to, transcribing in his own life. 6 more stations went dark in a single week, and the Keldrath hegemony filed a second complaint, and a third, and Delegate Tok stood before the full chamber and demanded, in a voice that carried through both sound and the chest vibration of a civilization that had governed this part of the galaxy since before humanity had invented writing, that the Accord take action. Theva Oren attended that session. She sat in the human delegation's chair. She said nothing through 3 hours of Tok's demand, and the procedural debate that followed, and 2 formal calls for the human bloc to respond. Then in the 4th hour she stood up. The chamber went quiet the way chambers go quiet, when the person who hasn't spoken in 4 months opens their mouth. You voted 847 to 156, she said. Her voice was quiet, precise, the sentence length of someone who has already decided they're not going to say more than is necessary. You knew what the 156 were trying to tell you. You chose not to listen. She paused. We have nothing further to explain to this body. She sat down. Rel's stylus had stopped moving. He looked at his transcription surface and found that he had written her words correctly, completely, and in the right order, and that immediately below them, without any memory of writing it, he had written them again backwards. He stared at both versions for a moment. Then, in the margin, in handwriting that he would later note was smaller than his usual archival script, he wrote, This is the part where it changes. He was right. He had no idea yet how much. The 11 minutes of silence on the UES Horizons bridge had not ended when Droven spoke. It had simply changed shape. Rel understood this later, reading the crew depositions. The silence before Droven's order had been the silence of something breaking. The silence after was different, the silence of something setting, the way a fracture sets when the bone decides it is done moving. Everyone on that bridge had heard the difference. None of them had words for it. They used the same word anyway in deposition after deposition, independently, without coordinate. Calm. He was calm. But the word they reached for was not quite what they meant, and they all seemed to know it wasn't quite what they meant, and none of them could find the better one. Rel could not find it either. He wrote calm in his private notes and then crossed it out and wrote nothing in its place. What he could record was what came next. 3 months of it, 3 months that looked, from the outside, like nothing. The colony fleet's survivors returned to Earth. The official Accord incident report was filed, processed, archived. The Keldrath hegemony submitted its compliance summary. The Accord's administrative bureau sent a formal acknowledgement. The machinery continued turning, the way machinery turns when no one has yet decided to stop it. And then Velthara Station went quiet. And then the others. Rel had been piecing together the technical picture from sensor reports and investigation filings for 6 weeks, when the Hegemony Science Bureau submitted an analysis that used a phrase he had not encountered before in 40 years of reading technical documents. The phrase was probability envelope inconsistency, and the analysis used it to describe the sensor signature of objects that appeared at the edge of Keldrath detection range, and then did not appear, not in the way of objects that move out of range, but in the way of objects that are sometimes. Rel read the analysis twice. He wrote in his private notes, "The ships exist in more than one state at the same time. The Keldrath sensors can find them when they are partly. They cannot target them because targeting requires a thing to be fully present." He thought about this for a while. Then he wrote, 9 months ago, humanity did not have this technology. The Accord's combined research archive does not contain the theoretical basis for this technology. I do not know how to record what I am watching happen. He filed the analysis in the appropriate archive subfolder. He labeled it correctly. He did his job. The Keldrath patrol ship Vesserak was captured on a Tuesday. Rel learned this not from an official report, but from the complaint the Vesserak's captain filed with the Accord 36 hours after his ship was released, which described the experience in terms that the captain's formal training in hegemony military communication had clearly not prepared him. The complaint was 3 pages long. The first page described the technical details of the capture. A beam of some kind that had killed every external system simultaneously, communications and weapons and propulsion, without damaging the hull or injuring the crew. The second page described what followed, in the measured language of someone trying to maintain professional detachment while describing something that had removed the professional detachment from them permanently. The third page was shorter. It described the young Keldrath conscript in the row beside the captain, a soldier named Tauven who was 22 years old by Keldrath reckoning, and who had not eaten in the 36 hours since the ship's release, and who had, according to the captain, sat in exactly the same position in his quarters since they docked, and had not responded to orders or requests, or the captain's direct presence. The human commander's words were quoted in the complaint verbatim, because the captain had the presence of mind to record them on his personal log, even while the ship's systems were down. "We did not want them dead. We wanted them to carry what they'd done. Death is easy. Memory is a life sentence." Rel read that sentence several times. He added it to the private record, not the archive. Then he filed the complaint in the appropriate Accord intake system, which routed it to the Enforcement Committee, which had a 40-day response window. The response window passed without response. Of the first 14 Keldrath crews captured and released, Rel was eventually able to account for the outcomes of 12. 9 refused to return to military service. 2 were classified by Hegemony Medical Services as psychologically non-functional and transferred to care facilities. 1 became the first Keldrath crew member to give a public account of what Admiral Warden Koral's fleet had done at Karis Drift, speaking to a mid-tier species news in terms that the Hegemony immediately classified as treasonous, and that the Accord's Information Bureau, after a procedural debate that lasted 3 sessions, declined to suppress. The account spread anyway. It is a feature of information that the Accord had never fully accounted for. In Rel's opinion, that it spreads faster through the species who are trying to contain it than through the ones who simply let it move. The nanites were the next thing Rel had to find language for. He received the first orbital survey report 7 weeks after Theva Oren's 3 sentences in the chamber. The survey covered what had been the Keldrath colony of Veth-Poral, a world the Hegemony had governed for 600 years, which had maintained a population of 4 million, which had produced grain and processed ore, and served as a waypoint for military logistics along the Hegemony's southern administrative corridor. The survey described the planet's current condition using the technical vocabulary of environmental assessment, which was precise and thorough, and completely failed to convey what it was describing. So Rel read it twice, and then requested the image package that came with. The images showed a planet. The soil was intact. The river systems were intact. Whatever native biology Veth-Poral had possessed before the Keldrath settled it was, according to the environmental readings, not only intact but recovering, filling the spaces that 600 years of urban development had compressed. The atmosphere read clean. The water tables showed no contamination. Everything that had been built was gone, not bombed, not burned, Gone, as in absent, as in the way a word is absent from a sentence that no longer contains it. The survey noted trace mineral deposits in patterns consistent with structural foundations, the ghost outlines of where buildings had stood. The roads were visible as slightly different soil composition for about 18 inches of depth. Then the geological record resumed as if the roads had never been. The military installations were the same, foundation traces, then nothing. Rel sat with the image package for a long time. He wrote in his private notes, "The nanites eat metal and composite and process stone. They do not eat soil or water or living tissue. This is not a weapon designed to kill a population. It is a weapon designed to remove the evidence that a civilization was ever there." He wrote below that the civilian evacuation windows were 72 hours. The human ships formed corridors for non-combatant vessels. He wrote below that 9 worlds, 6 weeks. Then he wrote, they called it introduction. This was just the first handshake. He had found this phrase in an intercepted communication that had been routed to the Accord's Security Monitoring Bureau, and from there, to Rel's intake queue. The communication's origin point had been traced back to a human vessel that, according to the transit logs, had not been in the sector when the communication was sent. The communication's author was not identified. The phrase appeared in the middle of a longer message, most of which was logistical, and it was the only part of the message that sounded like something a person had chosen to say rather than something a person was required to report. Rel filed the communication in the archive. He kept the phrase in his private notes. In the Accord chamber, Talk demanded a response. He did this across 4 sessions, his vibration voice carrying through the floor, his amber eyes fixed on the human delegation's chair with an expression that Rel, despite 200 years of practice at reading Keldrath affect, could not name with certainty. The closest he could get was a species that is discovering, for the first time, that a decision it made cannot be unmade. Orin attended every session. She did not speak again until the 4th one, when Talk's demand for a formal Accord response had been seconded by 7 other delegations, and the chamber chair had addressed her twice. She stood. She looked at Talk. She looked at the 847 delegations that had voted in favor of Measure 7742C. She looked, briefly, at the 156 that had not. "You voted 847 to 156, she said. "You knew what the 156 were trying to tell you." The chamber waited. "You chose not to listen," she said. That was all. Rel wrote it correctly the first time. He noticed this specifically because it was the first time in weeks he had not caught himself writing something backwards, and the noticing of its absence told him something about how constant the presence had become. Keldrath Prime Star began to stutter on a Wednesday. This is how Rel would remember it. A Wednesday, mid-morning by Vithai's IV's rotation, when a researcher in the Accord's Astrophysics Monitoring Division sent an emergency flag to the Administrative Bureau describing anomalous readings from the Keldrath Home System's primary. The flag used the word stutter in informal notes attached to the technical data, and Rel, reading it, understood immediately what the word was reaching for. The star's light was flickering, not dramatically, not yet. Small variations in output, irregular, the way a candle flickers when there is wind in a room that should not have wind. The astrophysics team's analysis was 90 pages long and concluded, in its final paragraph, that the variations were consistent with controlled interference at the stellar core level, that such interference should be, according to all current theoretical models, impossible, and that whatever was causing it had been in place for at least 72 hours before detection. Attached to the analysis was a message, not filed through the Accord's official channels, transmitted directly to the Administrative Bureau's public address, which any member species could reach, and which almost none of them ever used for anything that mattered. The transmission originated from a human vessel whose registration number matched a ship that the Accord's own records showed had been decommissioned 4 years prior. The message was 11 seconds long, one voice, speaking Accord Standard, which was not a language any human was born into, but which this speaker used with the flat precision of someone who had learned it to be understood rather than to be liked. "This is Commander Nail Droven, Terran Reconstituted Fleet. You have 3 years, 2 months, and 9 days from the timestamp of this message to evacuate Keldrath Prime and its 3 inhabited secondary bodies. We will assist civilian transport. Any military action taken against evacuation corridors or human vessels during this period will reduce the timeline. The Karas drift debris field is preserved. The names are recorded. We remember all 589. 11 seconds. Rel listened to it 4 times before he filed it. What followed was not a war. Or it was a war, but not the kind the Accord strategic models were built to analyze, because the Accord strategic models were built on the assumption that wars were fought between parties of roughly comparable capability, and this was not that. The Keldrath fleet engaged human vessels 43 times in the first 6 months of the evacuation period. The human vessels suffered no casualties in any of those engagements. The Keldrath fleet's losses were total in 31 of the 43, 7.4 billion Keldrath evacuated across 3 years. That number, 7.4 billion, was the kind of number that required a specific act of imagination to process, and Rel performed that act because it was his job, and also because he had learned, in the months since Karas Drift, that refusing to perform it did not help anyone and simply left the number sitting there, unexamined, doing damage in the abstract that it did less of when you looked at it directly. 7.4 billion people, families, most of them, loaded onto ships not designed for the populations they were carrying, transported to worlds that had not expected, processed through refugee intake systems that the Accord had built for smaller emergencies, and were now running at several thousand% of design capacity. Children who had grown up in the same city their grandparents had built, on a world their civilization had held for millennia, carrying what they could carry. Rel wrote about one of them in his private notes, because he had learned from Myra's star chart that the specific is the only unit of measurement that works. A Keldrath child named Vas, age 11 by Keldrath reckoning, was interviewed by a Selûne refugee coordinator at the intake center on Palavar Station 3 months into the evacuation. The coordinator's notes described Vas as carrying a small case of personal item, one of which was a flat reproduction of a painting that had hung in the family's home for 4 generations. The painting was a landscape, mountains, and a particular quality of light that existed only on Keldrath Prime at a certain time of morning, and which would not exist anywhere again. Vas had asked the coordinator whether the star would still be visible from Palavar after it collapsed. The coordinator had said they didn't know. Vas had said, "I want to see it go." Rel wrote this down. He did not add any interpretation. In the chamber, Tok's government filed emergency motion, compliance challenges, precedent arguments, procedural stays. The Accord's legal bureau processed them. The human delegation did not attend the sessions in which they were debated. The sessions produced resolutions. The resolutions were transmitted to the Terran diplomatic office. They were, as far as Rel could determine from the absence of any response, not received in any way that functioned as a reply. Keldrath Prime's capital city was evacuated in the final 6 months. Tok's official residence, which he had occupied for 900 years, was the last government building to empty. Security footage from the complex's external camera, which continued transmitting after the staff departed, showed him leaving through the building's main entrance carrying a single case. He had worn the jaw restraint for the last time the previous week, at the final formal session of the Keldrath Hegemony's governmental assembly. The assembly had voted to dissolve itself rather than continue as a government in exile. The vote had been 203 to 1. Rel did not know how Tok had voted. He filed the record of the assembly's dissolution in the archive, in the subfolder for member species that had ceased to exist as governmental entity. He had added 12 entries to that subfolder in his career. This was the 13th. Outside the resonance spire, the Accord's unified fleet was assembling. The Accord's new rehook for this moment, which Rel had not written down because he did not need to, was the fact that the remnant kind were in the gallery again. He had noticed them at the start of that morning's session, which was a planning meeting for the fleet deployment, attendance limited to senior delegates and strategic advisors. Rel attended as an observer, as he always did, taking a seat in the back of the secondary gallery. The remnant kind were already there, 2 of them, geometric and shifting, their forms doing the thing they always did, which was exist at the edge of what Rel's senses were designed to process. They were not watching the session. They were watching something Rel couldn't see, which was to say they were oriented away from the display screens and the speaker's platform and the assembled senior delegates, oriented toward the wall of the gallery that faced, if you map the spire's position relative to the Accord's spatial coordinates, in the direction of human space. Rel wrote in his private notes, RK present again, upper gallery, not watching the session, facing human space. I do not know what they are looking at. He wrote below, they were here for the vote. They are here for this. I have begun to think they attend the moments when a door is closing, not to stop it, but to see that someone was present when it shut. He was not sure this was right. He wrote it anyway. The fleet departed the following morning. 50 species, 4,300 vessels, the largest assembly in Accord history, organized in 4 days, fueled and provisioned and crewed with the specific urgency of an institution that had spent 3 years watching something happen and had finally convinced itself that it could be stopped. Theva Oren attended the departure session. She sat in the human delegation's chair. When the deployment authorization was read aloud and the chair asked if the human bloc had any response, she said, "We are not attending this meeting." Then the human delegation stood up, all 6 of them, and walked out of the chamber through the side exit in single file, and Rel heard their footsteps going down the corridor and then nothing. He wrote the authorization into the record. He began to write the human delegation's departure. He stopped. He set his stylus down and looked at his transcription surface and looked at what he had written, and what he had written was, the human delegation departed the session at 14:07 standard. Ambassador Theva Oren was the last to leave. He had written it backwards. He did not correct it. He picked up his stylus and went to the observation gallery to watch the fleet form up on the sensor display, and he stood there for a long time, and he did not write anything else. The approach corridor to Accord Central Space ran between 2 inactive asteroids, which gave it a natural funnel shape that any fleet would use and that any defensive position would fortify. The combined fleet used it. 4,300 ships, in the most precise formation Rel had seen in his career, filling the corridor from edge to edge, their weapons arrays active, their identification markers broadcasting on every frequency the translation lattice supported. The UES Dominion was already there. Rel was back at the observation gallery when the fleet arrived. He had come back to this chair at this window because the sensor feed was clearest from here, and because, or rather, it was more than that. He had come back because this was where he had been standing at the beginning of the story he was transcribing, and some part of him understood that the story was now completing. On the display, the Dominion sat in the corridor's center. No lights, no marking. 2.1 kilometers against a wall of steel that stretched for 10,000 kilometers in every direction. Rel looked at the scale indicator at the corner of the display and then looked away from it, because the scale indicator made the human ship look like something that should not be making anyone nervous. And yet, the combined fleet's formation held for 4 minutes after arrival, while Admiral Thak Pauvin's communications team confirmed the Dominion's registry and completed the formal intercept protocol. Then, Pauvin transmitted. Rel heard it through the gallery's audio standard surrender language, the kind that had been in use since before Rel's career began, adjusted for scale, the Accord's authority, the charges, the demand for immediate compliance, the assurance of due process. 40 seconds of silence. Rel counted. The water sound came through the relay before Vel's voice did, which was probably not intentional and probably was not intended to mean anything, but Rel noted it anyway. The sound of liquid being poured into a container, the sound of drinking, the flat contact of the container being set on a hard surface. Small sound, ordinary sound, the kind of sounds a person makes when they are not performing urgency. Then, you want to know what real leverage looks like. She did not wait. The launch signature registered on the display. One object, bearing away from the fleet, away from the corridor, toward an uninhabited system 60 light-years distant, moving fast, faster than Rel's sensor display was calibrated to track comfort, which was a detail he noted without fully processing, because his attention had moved to the long-range array, where the bloom was already beginning. It started as a point, the way a match starts. Within 12 seconds, it was not a point. 60 light-years away, a star that had burned for 4 billion years was burning differently. The long-range sensors were not designed to show this in real time, because real time at 60 light-years was a meaningless phrase. What the sensors showed was the radiation front, the expanding shell of energy that traveled toward them at the speed at which all information travels, which was to say it was already on its way, and had been before the device reached its target. The display showed a white bloom at the edge of known space, symmetrical, growing at the pace of something that would not stop. Rel looked at it. He had studied stellar astrophysics as part of his archival certification 40 years before. He understood what he was looking at. He understood the yield. He understood that the energy represented in that white bloom, if converted to a number in units that any weapons system in the combined fleet could process, would require a chain of digits that would not fit in a standard display. He looked at the Accord fleet on the main display. 4,300 ships. None of them moved. 6 minutes. 44 seconds. Rel counted most of it without meaning to, and the counting felt like the only thing his hands knew how to do without the stylus in them. The first array powered down at 6 minutes and 44 seconds. A small ship, courier class, on the outer edge of the formation. Its weapon's signature dropped off the display. Rel watched the gap it left, then the ship beside it, then 3 ships together. A cluster of mid-range vessels near the formation's second tier, their arrays going offline in a staggered sequence that suggested the captains had been looking at each other across their respective bridges before deciding. It spread. It moved through the formation the way a particular kind of news moves through a building, not as a command, not as a decision, but as a recognition, one person at a time, of something that had been true before anyone said it. Rel watched the weapon signatures drop off the display and could not have explained, technically, why the pattern looked the way it looked, which was like a tide going out from the shore of the smaller ships toward the shore of the larger one. Later, when Rel was assembling the record, he would learn from crew depositions that the pattern had not been random. It had started with the captains who had living children at home. This was not a coordinated decision. No one had communicated it. No one had called across to the next ship and said, "If you have a child somewhere, power down." It had simply been the case that the captains with living children were the ones who had finished processing what the bloom on the long-range display meant, and having finished processing it, could not keep their weapons arrays powered on. From there it spread to everyone else. Admiral Thak Poavin's array was the last to go. His weapons officer was watching him, and Poavin did not look at the weapons officer when he gave the order, which the weapons officer noted in her deposition as the thing she remembered most clearly. The fact that he did not look at her, that he had already looked at everything he needed to look at, and had arrived somewhere on the other side of it by himself. He nodded once. His array powered down. The display showed 4,300 weapons signatures gone. The corridor was quiet in a way that corridors are not quiet when they contain 4,300 ships. It was the specific quiet of a question that has been answered in a way that makes the next question unnecessary. Vel transmitted no speech, no demand, no terms. One file, sent to every ship in the fleet simultaneously, the Resonant Spire's official vote record, pulled from the Accord's own archive, every name in the 847 and the 156 listed in the formal language of the session record. 847 in favor, 156 against. Rel in the gallery knew what the file contained because he had written it. He had been there when the walls hummed. He had corrected the transcription he wrote backwards. He had filed it in the subfolder that held all the decisions that the Spire's crystal had absorbed, all the sounds that had been pulled into stone and would not leave. He reached for his stylus. He tried to find, in the controlled formal language he had used for 200 years, the words for what the vote record meant when it was the only thing transmitted at the moment. 4,300 warships stood down. He could not find them. He put the stylus down. He looked at the gallery wall that faced human space. The remnant kind were gone. He turned to look for them. The upper gallery was empty. The shift geometry, the quality of presence that was not quite solid, gone, without the sound of departure, without any trace of the moment of... He had not seen them go. He had not seen them arrive this morning either, he realized, which meant he had never once seen them cross a threshold. They were simply present or they were not, and the space they occupied when they were present had the texture of a decision that had already been made before you arrive. Rel wrote in his private notes, "RK departed the gallery at some point after 8:50. No record of departure. I have now observed them on 3 occasions. I have never seen them enter or leave. I cannot find, in any archive I have access to, a record of when they arrived this morning." He thought about this for a moment. He wrote, I cannot find a record of when they arrived for the vote. I checked this morning before the session. The gallery monitoring logs show them in place, but no entry. It is as if the record begins when they are already there. He set his stylus down. He sat in the observation gallery for a long time after that, watching the bloom at the edge of the sensor display continue its slow expansion toward the edge of the frame, and did not write anything else. Chauven Tak lived in the Keldrath Refugee Processing Center on Malin's world, which was a mid-tier planet that had been Keldrath-aligned for centuries and had accepted the largest share of hegemony refugees out of proximity rather than sentiment. His quarters were functional. He had, Rel gathered from the Compact's relocation records, filed 7 formal grievances through the new Galactic Compact's administrative intake system since his arrival. The grievances cited procedural violations in the hegemony's dissolution proceeding, improper application of the Compact's founding charter, and what Tak had labeled, in the formal language of Keldrath legal tradition, civilizational misconduct. All 7 were logged and unanswered. He had not been seen in public wearing the jaw restraint since the day of the Governmental Assembly's dissolution. Rel noted this in the record not as an interpretation, but as a fact. The restraint had been a formal instrument, and there was no longer a formality to observe. The Galactic Compact's founding charter was ratified 11 months after the fleet stood down. 51 species signed on in the first week. The remaining member species of the old accord signed within 90 days. The Charter's enforcement provisions gave human patrol ships standing authority to intervene in any member-on-member conflict, and the Charter's historical preamble referenced Karis Drift by name, which was a thing that had been debated in the drafting session, and decided in the end by the simple fact that no one could argue, with a straight face, for leaving it out. Human patrol ships appeared at 3 active border conflicts in the Compact's first year. All 3 conflicts ended within weeks. The species that had voted with the 156 received the same formal courtesy as the species that had voted with the 847, which was something that the 847 had debated among themselves and found more unsettling than they had expected. Courtesy extended without distinction was a form of message. They understood it without being told. Ambassador Theva Orin attended the Compact's founding session. She sat at the human delegation's table. She signed the charter on behalf of the Terran government with a pen, which was an instrument no other delegation used, all of them having brought their respective signing tools, and the choice of a pen was either unremarkable or was, like many of her choices, a thing that meant exactly what it appeared to mean with nothing hidden in it. Rel attended the founding session in his archival capacity. When it was done, he walked through the corridor that ran behind the Elder Observer Gallery and found the gallery empty, as it usually was. He stopped and looked at the space for a moment. The same 2 seats, the same angle to the view of the chamber floor. Nothing different except that the gallery had been occupied 3 times in the past 2 years and was now not occupied, and the record of those occupations contained entries and no entries at once. He went to find Theva Orin. She was in the corridor outside the main chamber, speaking to one of her delegation staff. When the staff member left, Rel approached and introduced himself, which he had never done before in 200 years of watching proceedings. She looked at him with the focused attention of someone who does not waste attention. He told her what he had seen, the remnant kind at the vote, at the demonstration, at the Compact's founding, the gallery entries with no arrivals, the records that began with them already present. Orin listened to all of it. "We have a Yathani archivist on staff," she said. "Older than you, I think. She told me they appeared the day of the vote. She said they come when a civilization crosses a threshold it can't uncross." She paused. I asked her if they'd appeared since. Rel waited. She said yes, day the fleet stood down. Orin looked at the ceiling briefly, the specific look of someone recalling exact words. She said they weren't watching the fleet. They were watching something in human space. Rel said, "I saw that, from the gallery. They were facing away from the display." Orin nodded. "Did she say what they were watching?" Rel asked. "No," a pause, 2 beats of silence. "She said they've never spoken, not once in the archive, not to any species in any record we have." Rel thought about this. He thought about the gallery, the records that began in the middle of their presence. The faces, if they had faces, oriented towards something the sensor displays didn't cover. Oren said, "I stopped trying to figure out what they know that we don't. I just make sure someone's paying attention when they show up." She said this in the flat, declarative way she said most things, 2 sentences and then she was done, and Rel understood that done meant done. He thanked her. She walked away down the corridor and he stood where he was for a moment, and then he went back to his desk. The Karis Drift Memorial Fleet was 8 ships. They held permanent station at the debris field's coordinates, which were logged in the Compact's registry under a new classification that had not existed in the old Accords category. Protected site, civilian casualty, non-salvageable, no salvage, no survey, no transit through the field itself. Ships that needed to cross that sector took the long way around. Commander Nail drove and commanded the Memorial Fleet's flagship. Lieutenant Peva Oren served on the same ship, navigation, same posting she'd held on the horizon. Her console had a small clay figure on its corner, slightly cracked along the base from an impact it had survived. She had repaired the crack with adhesive and set it back where it had always been. Rel had not been to Karis Drift. He had no reason to go there and every reason not to, which are not the same thing. He knew the Memorial Fleet's composition from the records, and he knew from a fellow archivist who had filed the fleet's activation documentation that the Horizon had been the ship Droven requested for his command, rebuilt and recommissioned, its name unchanged. 2 years after the Compact's founding, Rel received a transmission through the Accord's archival request system, which member species used to ask for copies of historical record. The request was from the UES Horizon, filed under Commander N. Droven, requesting a certified copy of the official vote record of Measure 7742C, including all delegate names and the official session timestamp. Rel processed the request himself. He printed the certified copy and transmitted it with the standard archival cover notation. He did not add anything to the cover notation. He thought about it. He decided not to. Some records carried their own weight. He filed the transmission log and closed his archive interface, and sat for a moment in the pale gold light of the spire's crystal walls, the green at the edges, the particular quality that had stopped registering after decades and had started registering again somewhere in the last 2 years. In his private notes, the last entry he had written nothing for several weeks. He opened it. He wrote, "The remnant kind have not appeared since the Compact's founding. The gallery is empty. I check it most morning." He wrote, "I do not know if the records that begin in the middle of their presence are errors, or if that is simply the nature of certain kinds of witnessing." He looked at what he'd written for a moment. He did not write it backwards. He closed the notes. On the UES Horizon, at the permanent station above the Karis Drift debris field, the navigation screen showed the field's coordinates and the slow orbital path of the 8 memorial ships, and, at the upper edge of the screen's frame, the approach corridor used by civilian traffic rerouting around the protected zone. Above the navigation screen, 3 strips of hull repair tape held a piece of paper against the console housing. Loose leaf, blue ink, constellations slightly wrong, some of them improved upon, 2 stars added near Cassiopeia where no catalog had ever placed them. The ink had not faded. The paper had gone soft at the corners from years of recycled ship air, and the particular stillness of a place where no one touched it, only looked. 2 names, written in a 9-year-old's handwriting, slightly larger than the others, placed where she had decided they belonged. Blink, Freckle,